Today's video is proudly brought to you by Audible. Get your free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at www.audibletrial.com/MagzTV or click the link in the video description below. G'day ladies and gents, and welcome back to Rise of Flight with Mags, and welcome aboard the Airco DH.2. The DH.2 is a rather interesting example of the practicality and ingenuity of the time. It was first flown in 1915. At that time, synchronization gears were completely in the hands of the Germans. Nobody else had them yet, and as such, only the Germans had machine guns capable of firing directly through their own props. But before we go into too much detail about that, today's flight is a two-ship flight of DH2s, one myself and a wingman, versus a patrol of Irondeckers, 4 Irondeckers in total that we have just encountered. Or, well, 3 Irondeckers now. We are over the German side of the front. We will have to cross the front again in order to be able to go home, and this seemed to be the best matchup to come across for the DH2 because the DH2 was designed to fight the Irondecker. During this early phase of the war, the DH2 was actually a fantastic aircraft and did exceptionally well against the Irondecker itself. But as more advanced German aircraft designs came into play, the DH2 was rapidly rendered obsolete and phased out. Now, as I'm sure you've noticed with the aircraft, the DH2 is a pusher design. This was Airco's answer to the problem of not having the synchronization gear. The ability for a fighter to be able to fire directly in front of itself under the control of the pilot is incredibly important, even in these early stages of aerial warfare. But in 1915, it was an ability that was only held by the Germans, who had the synchronization gear. The synchronization gear timed the trigger pulls on the weapons mounted to the aircraft so that the aircraft could fire in between the rotations of the prop without the bullets actually striking the prop. Allied aircraft in this time frame had to get around this by, well, a whole variety of different means. Some designs mounted the machine guns on top of the wings so that they would fire over the top of the prop without actually having to pass through it. Some aircraft designs at the time mounted them far out on the wings, trying to get them away from the prop that way. At least one French design put metal shields on the insides of the prop blades and then had machine guns just fire directly through, figuring that any rounds that actually hit the prop would just ricochet safely away from the aircraft. The Airco company, on the other hand, had a slightly different idea. How about we put the engine and the prop in the back of the aircraft and have it push the plane rather than pull it? That way there's no prop in front of the aircraft that the pilot needs to fire through or fire around. And the result was quite the success, but not as big a success initially as you would think. But we'll get back to that in just a moment. Rip some shots up the fuselage and we hit something important in the wing and it collapses. And I love how abruptly these planes just stop when they hit the ground. And a quick ammunition change on the Lewis gun. Mid-air reloads being not just a thing seen in arcade games in World War I, it was actually quite common to actually have the pilot reload the weapons as he was flying. So, time to go find ourselves some new targets. So anyways, the DH2 initially wasn't overly liked by its pilots. It was a great aircraft, but it was extremely touchy on the controls. This was a side effect of having a pusher prop that was mounted directly in front of the tail control surfaces, that is to say the rudder and the elevator. This meant that pretty much all of the thrust that the engine could actually generate was driven directly onto those control surfaces at a very, very close range. The end result was an aircraft that was incredibly maneuverable, but one that wasn't overly accepting of new pilots, and at the time, especially in World War I, early World War I, pilot training was not exactly what you would call overly in-depth. A high percentage of the DH2's pilot candidates actually died simply trying to learn how to fly this plane. Although, for those few who actually did manage to master the controls, they found a plane that was incredibly nimble, incredibly maneuverable, and had none of the drawbacks of having to fire around a large prop mounted in the front of the aircraft. And speaking of firing, let's talk about the armaments. The weapon system that was mounted to the DH2 was nothing more than a standard 7.7mm Lewis gun. This was virtually identical to the Lewis guns that were used by ground forces at the time. In fact, the pilot used exactly the same iron sights in order to line up, with the only change being a small windshield just to deflect wind away from the pilot's eyes so he could see more clearly. The drum magazine contained 47 shots in total, and the pilot had 3 reloads that sat in small wooden racks directly in front of the aircraft, which you can see modelled in the cockpit here. Changing the drums was exactly the same as changing the drums on the standard Lewis gun. The pilot would often just toss the empty magazine over the side of the aircraft. This was done mainly so that the pilot wouldn't accidentally reload an empty magazine while in a panic during a firefight. And while the aircraft itself had slots in front for 3 magazines plus 1 magazine in the Lewis gun itself, it was actually not uncommon for pilots to take additional magazines and either wedge them down the sides of the pilot's seat or to have them strapped inside of their own flight jackets to ensure they had enough ammunition available if it was necessary. Another interesting feature on the DH.2 is the engine. The engine is actually of a French design. It is a Gnome single-valve rotary engine, specifically a Gnome Monosopape 9 Type B2. Gnome engines were considered to be some of the best and most reliable in the time frame, as they took an existing idea of the design and simplified it to the point of removing as many of the moving components as possible. This meant there was less chance for mechanical failures and the engines ran better overall. They're obviously air-cooled engines, but they use castor oil for lubricant, and they're also extremely pokey for the time, with the DH.2's B2 engine putting out 100 horsepower out of its 9 cylinders. However, the engine was missing a few features that somebody into modern aircraft might think would be requirements. For example, a throttle. Yes, the pilot of the DH.2 did not have to worry about throttle settings, as he did not have a throttle at all to worry about. At most, some of the aircraft were fitted with the ability to adjust the fuel mixture while in flight, which could influence the speed slightly. However, for the most part, speed control in the aircraft was actually governed by simply turning the engine on and off again. This was actually a surprisingly more complicated task than you would think. That the act of turning the engine on and off was not a problem. However, the pilot had to be very mindful of the rotations of the engine mounted behind him. You see, the engine didn't actually have the ability to restart in the air. It required somebody on the ground to manually start the rotation of the blades in order to fire them over. However, because the engine was a rotary engine, it had a lot of force behind it as the entire engine assembly rotated with the propeller blades. This meant the force of the actual engine's rotation could provide enough force to turn over the engine and actually start it up while in flight. Now, the catch was that the engine needed to be turned off and the aircraft allowed to slow, but it must be turned back on before the engine lost the required RPMs necessary to actually refire the engine and get itself back under power. If it failed to do this, the engine would stop and would act like a giant air brake attached to the back of the aircraft, and unless the pilot could get the plane down fast enough, would likely stall the entire aircraft, resulting in a crash. And it looks like from the sudden outpouring of smoke from that Eindecker, I just hit something rather important. As he slowed down and slotted in directly underneath me, pulled the aircraft into the vertical, pushing it into a stall and then re-diving down on the target. It's at this point worth talking about the actual stall characteristics of the aircraft. At low speeds, the DH.2 was noted as being incredibly easy to get into a stall. However, it was also noted as being extremely easy to recover, providing the pilot was experienced. And this was largely due to the predictability of the stalls. The aircraft would start a stall usually on the right wing and would start to try and go into a rotation to the right hand side. Left-hand wing stalls were unheard of unless the pilot was in an extremely hard left turn in order to trigger that effect. And overall, the aircraft's glide stability was actually pretty good, although you did have to bring the aircraft down rather flat, as the central point of mass in the aircraft was in the centre, as it is a rear-mounted engine. And our friend in the Eindecker is out of this fight. So with our second kill, it is time to head home. We're down to just one drum left for the Lewis gun, and we are running out of fuel slowly, and we have quite the flight to get back home. Anyways, ladies and gents, as we make our way across the smouldering ruins of no man's land, I'd like to say I hope you enjoyed the video and thank you very much for watching. I'm just going to let this one play out from here. It's just a smooth flight back to the runway, and I hope you enjoy it. Until next time, click that like button, subscribe if you want to see more, and as always, fly smart, fly safe, and I'll catch you in the skies.